Today I'm with Rick Minerich, Chris Marinos, and Robert Pickering. How you guys doing?
Very well, thank you.
I'll shake your hand away with you guys. You guys are all C# MVPs, but that's only because there isn't an F# MVP program.
Not yet, not yet. Next.
But that's your strength, because you guys are all known for your work with F#.
That's correct, yeah.
F# is a functional language, right?
Functional first, but it's also object-oriented and imperative, so that's something that gets lost a lot of time.
It does get lost, okay. Well, let's start with functional, though. Somebody define functional for me, Chris.
What is functional?
What is a functional language?
It's kind of hard to define, but basically it emphasizes immutability, declarative programming, functions as data, passing functions around as first-class citizens. Those are usually features of a functional programming language. Did I miss anything? Side effect-free functions.
I guess the official definition is programming without using states, so everything is, which kind of forces you to make everything an expression, so everything is suddenly a value. It's like the difference between using an if statement in C#, which is kind of the imperative mode.
Okay.
But C# also has this other mode, which is the
conditional operator, or the ternary operator.
ternary operator, thank you, because I've forgotten its official name.
It's actually the conditional. Ternary is just because there's three.
Right.
Yeah, but anyway.
But anyway, so that is an expression. It's going to return a result back up to the thing that you're assigning it to.
Okay, so this is every time you want to get some value, you go out and fetch that value at runtime as opposed to saving it in some stateful manner.
Yeah, you can save it. It's just that once you've saved it, you're then going to change it and pass it on into the next expression, which will then produce another result, which can be stored somewhere. But once you store it, it is bound, and you need to pass it into something else to make another transformation.
Okay.
So it emphasizes returning or yielding values rather than modifying state or doing things. Yeah.
Okay.
This effect in terms of programming, a lot of times, like when you write a C# program, you write a bunch of ifs, but there's no else, right? But in F#, you pretty much always have an else, because what you want to do is you need all your cases covered, because you always need to return something. And that's why there's certain functional language features that F# has, like discriminated unions. And they really enable this style of programming in ways that are just impossible right now in C#.
Okay. All right, and it's also an object-oriented language. Are other functional languages not object-oriented?
Most functional languages have some form of object orientation. You look at something like OCaml, that has its own way of doing objects, which is quite different to the way that .NET does objects. They use what's called structural typing rather than nominal typing. So in .NET, a type is represented by its name. In OCaml, it's just the members that make it up. So if you have an object with those members, it kind of fits in sort of a duck typing type way, except it's all static and calculated.
Okay. So I know that C#, at least the current version of C#, has some functional characteristics to it. You can write functional code in C#. Chris, I think I've even seen you do a presentation on how to write that code. So with the popularity of languages like C# and VB, why do we need F#? Why is that important?
Because F# turns it into 11.
You could just make 10 higher.
Pretty much. I think that actually sums it up pretty well.
What do you mean by that?
There's certain things you can't do in C#. So you take something like var, for example, and this isn't even functional programming, but so var type inference, right? And some C# programmers like it, some don't, but it's a pretty good feature. With F#, you have that taken up to 11. You have type inference all over the place. There's very few times where you actually need to specify the type of something, arguments or something else like that. So that's one place where F# takes it to 11, but that's not even a functional programming feature.
That's
things
just dynamic language.
Yeah, so another example of something that's more functional is if you're nesting functions in C#, you can say, you can have a nested function, but you have to give the type of it, and it's kind of a pain in the butt. You have to say func of int to int to int or whatever.
Okay.
And in F# you can just say let foo equals some nested function. That's helpful. And there's all sorts of other features like that. The design of the language just really embraces the style of programming.
I think you can do some reasonably good functional programming in C#, but you will, if you try and adopt a very functional style in C#, you will hit little niggles, like what Chris was talking about before. Another problem you tend to run into is void is not a proper type in C#, which means you've got this difference between the action type delegates and the function type delegates. So if you want to
The functions return something, the actions just do something?
Yeah, so if you want to write an abstraction that could take either a action or a function, you just can't do it. You have to jump through hoops to do that.
Okay.
I think it's also important to point out that in F#, because it's so expression-oriented, right, you can do things in the language libraries that you can't do in C# libraries. And that's why F# has async, and async is written as a library, which is like really a hard concept to get around because in C# they had to put it in the compiler because there's no support for sort of dissecting things in the sort of way that you can do it in F#.
Okay, so what I'm hearing, I think, is for a lot of things, the language is a lot more terse in C# or in F# than it is in C#. Things that you don't have, hoops you don't have to jump through in F#. You have to write out code and do it.
Yeah, terse is kind of, it is terse. Terse kind of has a good and a bad connotation to it.
Sure,
depending
it's
who you
less
talk to.
code to write.
It's more concise and it's more expressive in a lot of ways.
Okay.
In F# you tend to write more declarative code that kind of shows the recipe at a high level, and it's easier to read and understand, I think, than in C#.
Do any of you three write exclusively in F#?
I do.
This guy does.
Okay. And you guys, you mix F# with other languages, right?
Sure. What you tend to find is a lot of people want a sort of core in F#, like sort of the hardcore asynchronous programming, and then they'll use that as a library and just consume that from C#.
Okay, so let's talk about when will I use F#? You mentioned async. If I have async, is that if I have something that I need to do asynchronously, is that a flag should go off my mind that this might be a candidate for F#?
Well, certainly at the moment in the F# was the inspiration for the asynchronous features that have been put into C#. So
Maybe the ones in the next of C#.
in the VNext of C#. So if you have something asynchronous to do before the VNext of C#, you might be working in F# Go, but it's not exclusively for that.
What else? What are the other things that I would use F# for?
I think there's a couple areas that F# really shines. One is if you're doing any sort of data munging, if you're bringing in data from a lot of different formats and combining and doing transformations on data, which happens a lot with the web and other sorts of data sources, F# and functional programming in general are exceptional at that.
Why is that?
It's just kind of the nature of the way functional programming works. You tend to be kind of composing these little steps of bringing things together, and it's hard to explain why, but when you see it, it just works well.
I think also having a REPL where you can enter code interactively helps enormously for that kind of program, because it just gives you this little model where you can get your tests going very, very quickly on the data, and you can also change your code very, very quickly. You can sort of load up the data set and then try several different functions on that same data set, maybe in a way that you wouldn't be able to do without that.
Okay. And I've heard that for like hardcore calculations, scientific calculations, F# is good for that. Why is that?
You can represent them really concisely and in a way that's very similar to the way the math looks. So one thing, I've done a lot of C++ programming, which is even on the further extreme away from functional programming, and then I've done a lot of F#, the same things, and C# as well. But the thing is that the closer you get to functional, the closer it is to like a sort of mathematical representation. And so like if you're doing like a lot of calculations like you might do in Excel on a big data set especially, then it's really nice because in terms of code readability, like you go back to it a year later and it reads like it's out of a textbook. You know what I mean? And
I think that touches on another area where F# is used, where it's something that domain experts like a lot. So I think there's a hell of a lot of people in the world that spend their time writing software, but wouldn't actually consider themselves computer programmers. I'm talking about people like quants, epidemiologists, people who make or meteorologists, that sort of thing, so that they write software as a means to an end rather than
Profession in itself.
a profession in itself. And there previously been quite a big disconnect in that they tend to use tools like MATLAB, R, which are great tools, but they're difficult to integrate. So you
Sure.
get this world where
Was
they're
it
doing their
standalone
thing.
applications?
Yeah. So it leads to them doing their thing in the corner, and then the results of that cannot be used by the more operational teams to build.
And F# kind of bridges that gap between the
Exactly.
programmers and the scientists, statisticians, mathematicians, and so on.
F# has gained a lot of traction in the finance sector, so people working in that industry that's one example where it maps really well, and you're not limited to just those kinds of standalone R, MATLAB. You have the whole .NET ecosystem at your fingertips. You can interoperate pretty seamlessly with C# and VB, so it's a value add in that sense.
Okay.
Certainly, it's really nice when someone who, sort of the PhD in the corner can just hand something off to the graphics dev, and they can make something beautiful out of it that's usable. So you
Yeah.
have the guy who really understands the deep stuff, and the guy that's more of the designer, and they can work together fluidly without there being like this big wall of separate tool sets and misunderstandings. Right?
Sure, sometimes you have to build a domain-specific language just so those two pieces can talk to each other.
Exactly.
So is that what you're doing? You say you're writing all your code in F#. Are you then as somebody else taking that code and calling it from, say, a WPF application or something like that?
Well, right now we're integrating with another tool,
Okay.
and the tool outputs its own languages output. It's just a set of data records, right? We do certain types of machine learning on that, and then have to re-inject that in the records and output all that. And F# makes a really nice stream model of sequences. They're all enumerable, and you can just sort of do your calculations in the middle and push through things. And you can deal with very large data sets because it's all sequence-based, right? It doesn't all have to be in memory at the same time. You're just doing it as a stream.
Right.
It's beautiful.
Okay. And you guys are doing similar things, but you're integrating with code that you're writing yourself.
Yeah.
Because you're also C# or VB
Yeah.
or whatever other language. Are there any good books for the
There
beginner
are several.
to learn about F#?
So I wrote a book called Beginning F#, which is really nice. Rick helped write a book called Professional F#, which is very much in the same vein. Another book that I really like, and I actually think is better than my book, is Real-World Functional Programming in C# and F# by a guy called Thomas Pickering. And that is a really beautiful book because it's for C# programs anyway, because it takes sort of examples of common patterns in C# and shows them how you do that in F#. So it's good.
Okay. That's a great place to get started. Before we go, if you guys have an online presence you want to promote, tell us about it.
So I'm strangelights.com/blog.
ChrisMarinos.com.
RichardMinerich.com.
Guys, thanks a lot. I really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thanks for having us.
Technology
and friends.